When you're working with people and you just see that they connect with what you're saying and the light bulbs turn on, it's actually a very rewarding experience. We have the expression, it's not what you know, it's who you know. But I think there's one more step. It's not what you know, it's not who you know, it's who knows you. Trust, integrity has been a defining point because of what happened through that failure. Failure can change us and it can shape what we learn and how we approach life.
Welcome to the Academic Adventures podcast. This podcast is all about people who have embraced the opportunity to combine their academic work with entrepreneurial ventures. You'll hear about the highs and lows, balancing responsibilities and grabbing opportunities, plus advice for anyone thinking about following a similar path. Hello there, I'm your host Sarah McLusky, and my academic adventurer for this episode is John Storm. John is a senior lecturer at the University of Aberdeen Business School. He is also an independent consultant working with companies around the world. John started his career in the corporate world, and he spent 10 years living and working in China in a variety of different sectors. A move into executive education eventually led to his role at Aberdeen, where he supports postgraduate business students using his experience and contacts to offer insights and make connections. It hasn't all been plain sailing, and as you'll hear, a betrayal and bankruptcy taught him the value of trust, integrity, relationships and reputation. His network helped him through, and as he now tells his students, to succeed in business and in life, it's not what you know, it's not who you know, it's who knows you. Welcome along to the podcast, John. It's lovely to have you here. So, all of our guests have had slightly different combinations of ways that they combine their academic world and the business world. And I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about the way that you bring those two things together in your life.
Yeah, thanks for having me here, Sarah. And it's a good question to start off with. I think when we look at people who work at universities, we can tend to see loosely two different types of stream of people. You get some who go to university from high school, get to undergraduate, postgraduate, go on PhD, and they have that traditional academic route. And then you've got a lot of other people who have maybe come from industry, and academia might be a way of giving back, feeding into the next generation, and different types of things. So for myself, I'm that latter category. I've been working in various industries. I wouldn't say on a particular trajectory at all, and somewhat found myself in academia initially back in 2015, and but even then, when I look back and think that I first came in and joined the university, it was joining a university to set up a new department. So even then, I would still classify that as being somewhat entrepreneurial in nature. And most of my roles at universities have been to set up or to bring some form of change. So there's an entrepreneurial twist, I suppose, within what I've been doing within my academic roles.
And why has that? I mean, you've said there that you've come to academia then with this sense of kind of almost giving something back. So why is this the right point in your journey to do that?
So initially, maybe that wasn't the motivation. The motivation for my first encounter with education was I was running in other entities. I was probably working, the 100-hour weeks and all that sort of stuff. And it was a different time of life where I was getting married and these things too. And I just kind of thought, maybe this sort of lifestyle is not conducive to a good, stable marriage. And I thought I'd want to kind of just take a step back for a moment. And actually academia presented itself, or not academia in the research academic sense, but academia in terms of education, passing on knowledge, experience, focusing on empowering the next generation. It just looked comparably stable, which had its appeal for a particular season. But I think that was the maybe the initial motivation, actually a bit of stability. I came in for a short time. I then went back out again independent for a season. And then during COVID, on coming back to the UK, I found myself moving back into the education where it is much more about, the student centricity. When you're working with people and you just see that they connect with what you're saying and the light bulbs turn on, it's actually a very rewarding experience. So if anything, maybe there's a bit of selfishness in there too. You know that you're doing something and you get that immediate acknowledgement, that's actually quite fulfilling.
Yeah, excellent. So your experience that you had, so as you said, you were very much kind of out in the business world for a long period of time before coming to academia, and involved a lot with international companies. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that role or those roles. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I grew up in the UK. My parents have a art business where the clientele is very much international. So there's always sort of been that international connection. But after, university, I moved overseas. I was in Hong Kong for a period of time, actually starting up a new department in a garment manufacturer. So that was in sustainability, in apparel. And then I moved into mainland China. I was in Beijing. I was working in the smart home area, doing a lot in design to market. I did that for a few years, moved elsewhere in mainland China, and through exposure into education, I sort of transitioned into the corporate training and executive education sort of landscape. Still quite entrepreneurial, but it meant that there's been quite an international element, not only from a clientele point of view, but also from me in my life. And I spent 10 years in China, 10 informative years, I would say, as well, because I went in my early 20s. So it's a time where, yes, you've got experience that you're leaning on, but you're still in that ripe ability to unlearn, which is harder for a lot of other people who move overseas at a later point in life.
You must bring a lot of learning from working overseas to the academic work that you do now, to the students that you work with.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, for myself, ironically, I actually view myself as an expat in Scotland, even though I grew up here. Yeah. And the reason why I mentioned that and how it links to your question is that I find I often relate more to some of our international students than I do to some of my local colleagues. I think there's a bit more of a connection, and that can feed back into the teaching practice. And part of that is who is the student audience. So I work at the University of Aberdeen. I'm not really engaged so much in the undergraduate. It's more the postgraduate, particularly the executive education area. And 2/3 or more of the students are Chinese or from the Asian sort of context. So these are countries which arguably I've lived in longer from an employability perspective than I have in my own country.
Yeah, and what are some of the big differences that you notice? You said there you sometimes feel like you relate more to those students. What are those things that make you feel that connection, do you think?
Some of these things are really hard to pinpoint, to be honest. And the thing is, sometimes these things can come across as potentially being negative as well. One of the things, particularly in the China landscape, or just developing countries in general, is that there's very much a proactiveness when a challenge, an issue emerges. You need to tackle it. Not necessarily head on in terms of use blunt force and tackle the immediate problem, the symptoms of it, but often it's circumvent and go around it. But the one way or another, it's like, okay, there's an issue, we do it now. Whereas I find so much of the time here, it's more along the lines of either, well, first there'll be a slowness, then it will be a questioning the interpretation and how significant is this issue, and then it will be a let's discuss with so many people, and we try and be inclusive, but we can often be inclusive to the point where we're involving people who have got no relevance to it, and the dialogue becomes so excessive. It's all talk and no action, and then 2 months later, you've done less than sometimes people in developing countries would do in half an hour.
Yeah.
And like I say, that can sometimes come across as being a little bit generalistic and negative, but it's how it feels. And in the end, those students have that feeling.
I think these cultural differences, as you say, it's sometimes being mindful about the way that we identify them and talk about them, but that isn't necessarily being negative about these differences. You know, it's pointing out differences, I think, can be really useful to learn from different cultures. So in the role that you're in now, obviously you're doing a lot of advising and supporting people coming through with an interest in starting businesses and things like that. But you are yourself still now, you've got your academic role, but you do have a business role as well. So how do those two things come together?
Yeah. So the academic side, I really enjoy the engagement with students. You know, when that light bulb moment happens is great. But then also on the other side, I get involved in just a range of, I'd say, advisory and consultancy type projects. And these can be spanning regions as well. I'm involved in projects in Bangladesh, in parts of Africa, and have quite regular engagements out in mainland China too. You know, so how do I manage that time balance? That can be challenging. It can be very challenging. COVID has actually helped a lot because it's pushed a lot of things online. And sometimes in advisory things, they're also somewhat flexible and it's just kind of ad hoc. But yeah, I don't know. I've managed to make it work somehow.
And you keep those things quite separate. So you've got your academic role and then the business roles are quite separate. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, definitely from a compensation point of view, there's a separation, which can, you know, work in your benefit. But then at the same time, it's also about finding synergies.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So a couple of hours ago, I had a call and I was sort of moderating a roundtable, and we had various people from industry, and you know, they might be private connections who I'm bringing in, and these sort of connections can stem from my private practice, but can feed into the educational sector where I'm inviting students to come and listen to this kind of audience, which they otherwise wouldn't be able to achieve. So, yeah, I would say financially and from a legality point of view, they are distinct. But definitely from a teaching point of view, it's about finding synergies.
Yeah. I can imagine that with all that huge amount of experience you've got, there will be a lot of overlap there in learning. And that's, you know, one of the reasons you're in the position you're in, isn't it? Because you've got those things you can do to help and support students. So whether this is for yourself or for the students that you work with, what kinds of practical support have you found help to get business ventures off the ground?
First and foremost, it is about network and who you know. We have the expression, it's not what you know, it's who you know. But I think there's one more step. It's not what you know, it's not who you know, it's who knows you. Because, you know, you can know lots of people, but in the end, when you're starting something off, you often need to take, or at least receive, support and be willing to ask, and you're wanting to minimize the number of no's that you're going to get when you're asking those questions. So if you know people and if they know you, the response and the level of support will be greater. So I would say that this is a very significant point, because, you know, we say that there's 6 degrees of separation between yourself and any person on this planet. If you think about that from a practical point of view, if you can have people who know you and are willing to support you, then immediately you've gone from 6 to 5, if not lower, right? So you're getting one step closer immediately to whoever it is that you need access to, whether that's a funder, whether that's a legal advisor or a potential client or whatever it might be. So I'd say that's first and foremost. You absolutely need to be willing to ask for support. And I would say that actually in the UK, universities are fantastic places because, you know, why bother, unless you're immediately employing people, why bother renting when most universities will have some form of free incubators type space where you can register, where you can get access to advisory services, where you can have a hot desk. Immediately this is cost cutting, and you want to be as lean as possible. I think when you kickstart your first entity, and then just networking and being willing to ask. As I say, I think these are quite fundamental steps.
Are there any particular things that you've found? So networking is something that scares a lot of people. Are there any things you particularly found helpful, or techniques or anything like that have been useful?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, because I say networking, and in Asia there's what we would call quite a highly relational type cultures. Mm-hmm. So again, it's very much about network and your relationship with people. But then maybe hypocritically, coming to the UK, I don't necessarily network in the conventional sense. So I think we often say network, and then as a listener, that might mean, or might interpret it as to go to events, mm-hmm. right? And then if you're at an event where you don't recognize people, and it's just that cold start, and you've got all of those lukewarm conversations and awkward, and it's like, or maybe you're not quite sure because you're developing your idea. So it's like, oh, so what do you do? It's like, mm-hmm. I do something, and you're hesitant, and you're fumbling with words, and then you just become really easy to dismiss, right? So you can very quickly get out of the crowd, so to speak. I don't think that's what we need to, or that's how we should necessarily interpret network. Network can include just phoning a friend, mm-hmm. And getting just general support, just chatting about ideas. It doesn't have to be networking at formal things. So maybe my point is that we can expand what we mean by networking. It doesn't have to be formal.
Yeah, I think
it can be more natural.
Yeah, really good advice. Start with who you know, and take it from there.
Yeah.
So I'm sure with all the things that you've been involved with over the years, there have been times when things haven't worked out quite the way you've planned. What sort of experiences have you had with that, and what did you learn from it?
So one of the defining points in my life, I would say, was back in 2013, 2014. One of the partners I was working with, shall we say, siphoned off a significant amount of money from the company. In local currency, it was a 7-figure amount, so it's not a small amount. And in the end, it had a chain reaction where we started basically falling behind on certain payments, which then went into arrears, which then impacted supply, which then lost sales. You then, if you lose $10 million in sales, then we were going through funding, you then lose your funding, and company went bankrupt. So that was, frankly, a very significant thing, and resulted in failure. And there was a lot of stress with that. The thing for me was, I had some people pull around me at that time who were very supportive. And part of it, they were not necessarily friends in the traditional sense. They were actually also business partners, but other companies. And some of it had been, the terms of our contracts with them, where there was one company particularly who was doing some of the marketing for us, where I'd made some mistakes in negotiating our contractual terms, where we agreed on, basically we're all using some platforms, and we agreed on offering them a commission based upon what we earned, but we didn't specify if it was net or gross. Mm-hmm. So when it came to facilitating payment, we paid them on gross and not on net. And we didn't tell them. We just did it. And it was 3-6 months later, whenever they found out, and they came back and said, hey, that was great. Why did you do that? You could have paid us on net. Mm-hmm. And, we said we valued the relationship. So those same partners came back when I found myself in a mess. And they were like, what do you need? We're going to pull you out of that. We're going to hold you. We're going to support you. we're going to help you through this. And the reason why I share this story is it emphasizes the importance of integrity. The strongest partners who have had around were around because of integrity in making business decisions. That's important, and it strengthens relationships, which will, in the end, I think, come back and feed into what you do. And that, for me, was a defining point. I mean, later on, one of my entities, we called it No Wando, which is a Chinese term. The No means promise, and it comes from integrity. My daughter's name is Noah C. Noah, again, it's the same Chinese character. My daughter's Chinese, so it's the same character. Trust, integrity has been a defining point, like I say, for the past 10 years of my life, because of what happened through that failure. Failure can change us, and it can shape what we learn and how we approach life as well as new venture.
Yeah, and I think it also speaks to the value that you've already said that you place on networks and relationships as well, because those networks and relationships have held you through difficult times. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And the thing is, our values can also create issues at times too, right? Because let's just say one person's value is towards, I don't know, like precision or quality, right? And how we perceive quality. So, if we want to be emphasizing inclusiveness, for example, and quality decision making, then the way that we might go around and do that can be, in many ways, quite controversial. Actually, these can be good values, but it can be stressful. It can result in judgment, and we need to be very careful, and in terms of within our values, never to then come back and be like judging other people or getting overly stressed when other people around might not necessarily attain to certain standards. That can become unhealthy quite quickly.
Certainly for me, learning a lot about understanding values and how they apply themselves has really helped me to understand that different people come from different places, and helping to give people that little bit of grace, doesn't it? Yeah. One thing that we're interested in asking all our guests is, what does success mean to you now? And is that something that's changed over time?
I think that's a great question. For myself, I would say that success is when you are able to say no. So if you are starting something off and a potential client or whatever comes along, you might need to say yes, because you need the income streams, you need the revenues, or whatever it might be. You might need to work with clients which are awkward, which you don't enjoy working with, characters who you don't sync on well with, but you need to, but for a lot of people, this is one of the joys of being in the entrepreneurial sector, where you're not working to corporate KPIs and things. You have more autonomy. So once you get past those initial stages, and then you can start saying no to projects, that I think you are getting more successful, because that's going to feed right back into your quality of life, your contentment, your happiness, the projects that you're working in, the people that you're working with. Yeah. So when you can say no.
And is that something that's been a recent revelation, something that's changed from when you were younger? You said you used to work very long hours in the early part of your career.
When that occurred, I don't know. I mean, definitely, I have been on my own journey. I mean, we all have our own journey. My journey was maybe more influenced from some, shall we say, failures and letdowns from people in the past. But in terms of success, actually, because I moved into the working in small entities at a very, or comparatively young age, it meant that I maybe had to decline or step away from what could otherwise have been considered a more traditional career. So for a lot of people, success is, you work in the big name company, and then you work your way up and you get to, C-suite or whatever, which might have been an option. So I guess taking the direction I did, I quite consciously worked away from that, but viewed success not in terms of the ability to say no, but more in terms of the contentment on the types of projects.
Yeah. No, that's a pretty good measure of success there as well, I think. And so, again, this might be something that comes up when you're working with students already, but for anybody who's listening, who is thinking maybe about starting a business, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, when starting a business, I think in the UK, one of the things or in the West in general, it's often a lot of people who are quite young who are involved in entrepreneurial areas. Whereas one of the trends, I would say, it's maybe slightly changing now, but traditionally one of the trends more in the Asian sphere was that people would first have a career, and then when they were a bit more kind of financially independent or had reached a particular point in life, they might look for more in terms of self-satisfaction, and that would kind of be the point where they start moving into something more entrepreneurial. And the reason why I start with that is because from an advisory point of view, I think it's related. I think it's good to have a profession where you've got a skill set, and that means that there's something that you can fall back on. I also think that it's important to have a reputation, and reputation comes with having experience and some at least exposure within a particular career track. Because in the end, the world's a competitive place. Why should I choose you? So we're usually building upon reputation or network. It's a similar thing. So to go straight into that from university, I think is a particularly challenging scenario. If anything, the advice might be to maybe balance, to try and have some form of comparatively stable traditional employment, and then have this on the side at first, because it's entrepreneurial things are, you can almost start that at any time in your life. Whereas a traditional career track, if you don't kind of go into that within 2 years from university, it's very difficult to then come in later.
Interesting advice. And as you say, often counter to what we see in the, in the kind of public narrative. Yeah. We've come to a point we should probably think about wrapping up our conversation. But thank you so much for taking the time to come along and have a chat about your experiences.
Thank you, Sarah, for having me. It's been good to chat.
If you've been inspired by this podcast, head over to our LinkedIn page and tell us about your biggest takeaways. You'll find a link in the show notes, or just search for Academic Adventures Podcast. This podcast is a collaboration between the University of the West of Scotland, Converge and Sarah McLusky. The podcast team includes Orla Kelly, Adam Kosterka, Jen Black and me, Sarah McLusky. The Academic Adventures podcast is proudly supported by the Scottish Ecosystem Fund 2023 to 2024.